W, woke, period. Consciously be aware what you saying. A, accents matter. Stress and expression, romance, swagger. G, grammar check. Conjugate the verbs, use the right verb tense. A, tengo un secreto. Escúchame bien. Hey, hola, 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 everybody. Hola, everybody. ¿Cómo están? Espero se encuentran bien. Hope all is well. Yo me llamo Jessie Feliz. My name is Jessie Feliz, and I'm the host. Yo soy la presentadora de Spanish Swag. Boop! Ballin'!
Yeah!
Guess what, everybody? Hoy tenemos un invitado bien especial. We have a special guest all the way from the other side of the pond. And I'm so happy to have Senor Joe Dell, the modern foreign languages and technology consultant from the UK. Round of applause.
Hey, Jessie, it's amazing to be here. I love that introduction. I think that's the most dynamic introduction I've ever heard on a podcast. Either one I've appeared on or one that I've listened to. That was fantastic. Great stuff for language teachers everywhere to get you hyped up for this podcast episode.
Absolutely, absolutely. Y gracias a usted. Thank you so much for taking the time out. I know we have una diferencia de 5 horas, a 5-hour difference between Eastern Standard Time. And let me know, what is it called? I'm so used to Eastern, Central, Western, Pacific. I mean, not Western, Pacific time. What is it called in the UK? Is it GMT or?
Yeah, so now it's GMT, which is Greenwich Mean Time. And then before the end of October, it was British Summertime or BST. I always get confused whenever I'm planning webinars. I always find it can be a bit of a nightmare in relation to working out the exact timings based on what time the webinar is on. So I use a Chrome extension, which let me just remind myself which one it is. It's called. Just give me a second. I will just hang on. Just give me a second because this is a useful one for those people who like to organize their webinars. There we are. So I just do that bit again, if that's okay. Yeah, absolutely. So BST, British Summertime, before the end of October, and then GMT, Greenwich Mean Time, after October. And I always find that it's incredibly important to make sure when webinars are on in relation to when the do go back or go forward. That can be a bit of a nightmare. So I personally,
because everyone doesn't honor daylight savings time, and in some countries, I've been told that Mexico is moving forward. They're not going to go back and forth based off the time of year, the daylight savings time. America Central, Central America does not do it at all. So I'm used to either being 2 hours difference, and then all of a sudden now I'm a 1 hour difference with my friends and close loved ones in Costa Rica. So, it's really important for us to have these Chrome extensions as needed so we can all still stay communicated, in connection and on time.
You got that right.
Absolutely. And the Chrome extension I would recommend that I use for this is called Timely. It's completely free, and it just allows you to put in obvious sort of time zones like Eastern, for example, and it just allows you to compare what time it would be in the UK, wherever you may be, with that particular time zone. So it does mean that you can make sure that you do attend when you're supposed to for the time zone in question. So yeah, it's absolutely fantastic Chrome extension for that particular niche job that you need to do.
Awesome. Okay, so Joe, before we get started learning un poquito más de ti, a little bit more about you, I have to always ask this question to people who have un dialecto, a dialect that's different from mine, or especially speaking with English, because like when I lived in Costa Rica, I lived in the El Sur Caribe, El Caribe Sur, which is the South Caribbean. So we have a lot of people of Jamaican descent who are nationally Costa Ricans, but their grandparents came over in the 40s and 50s to build the ferrocarril, the railroad. And so they speak patois, they speak Spanish, they speak English. And then here I come from the Midwest, from Detroit, Michigan, Detroit! And I have my own way of speaking English based off my microcosm where I'm from. But I've also lived in Baltimore, or we say Baltimore with a T, but everyone from Baltimore pronounces it with a D. So I absolutely love dialect in addition to learning about languages. So my question for you is, for us, I would say for the majority of us, como estadounidenses, as U.S. citizens, I don't even want to say Americans because Americas, we have many parts of this continent, but every time I hear someone who is British speaking, there's this level of hello. Like I feel very, even my formal voice, when I'm teaching people about usted, when you got to use usted form, you want to speak formally. I always switch it and it's this formal manner. So we're being totally hashtag transparent. When you hear my Black American, Detroit, Midwestern, but lived in other various places voice, do I sound American? That's really what I'm trying to ask. Do I sound where I'm from? That's what I want to know.
Well, I think, yeah, absolutely. You sound where you're from. You sound very, dynamic, as I said at the beginning, and full of, full of energy, which is fantastic. But I think as a result of global TV and the way in which we can now, certainly in the UK, for years and years and years, we've been able to watch lots and lots of US programs, hearing different US accents. It seems very, very normal. And I think also now with technology and streaming software like StreamYard we're using this evening, it's not a strange thing, I think, to be talking live with people from different countries. So yes, you sound absolutely lovely, Jessie. You sound very authentic from where
Oh,
you are.
thank you,
But then
darling.
if you just said your accent without saying the exact place in America where you were, I think I probably would have struggled with that. But you sound very American, whatever that means.
Okay. I know where I'm from. I know where I'm from. But I can also change. What I love about languages, we have like these official languages, but your I had a Spanish professor that talked about your idiolecto, which is your individualized lecto. And I love that because if you are born in one place and for the majority of your life, that is your domicile, that is your microcosm, then you share that regional dialecto, that regional dialect. However, if you have lived, not just traveled abroad for a short term or vacation, but if you have resided, like you were a resident elsewhere for a long period of time, your ears naturally become acclimated to sounding near native of that area. And so now you're bringing that along. And then if you move elsewhere, if you're this nomad, then you acquire different accents, and it's so rich and I love it. I absolutely love hearing people speak different languages, but even the variety of lectos within the English language. I absolutely love it so much. And I saw a video, forgive me, I cannot remember who it was, but it was a British citizen and he was going over the variety of British accents. And from us on this side of the pond, there may be this standard, what we perceive as like, oh, this British accent. And I mean, I wonder, like, obviously for people of England, is there like this standard American sound? Or do we consider, oh, this person's from New York or this person's from the South and they talk a little country just like this right here?
I think there are stereotypes, for example, of a New York accent, like grab me a coffee and all this sort of
Yeah,
stuff,
coffee
which
and cream,
again
coffee and cream.
which again would have come from TV shows and
Yes.
films and what have you. But yeah, absolutely. Going back to what you were saying, I mean, in the UK, you can drive just like a few miles, and you might find that not only are the accents very different, but words that people use about different objects can be very different. For example, from time to time, you see these things on Twitter, like people will post a photo of something and say, "How do you describe this?" And so, for example, one that comes up a lot is what I would call a bread roll, but that's because I come from the south of England. But in other parts of the country, particularly in the northern parts of the country, then there's a whole range of different terms to describe what I would call a bread roll, such as a batch and a cob and things like that. And it's absolutely fascinating. Another one, which is another nice one as well, is when you see, for example, a little path that goes between houses. Now, some people would describe that as a path, but there's a really lovely northern expression, which is a ginnel, which is one of my favorite words, which is Ginnel, which you'd never hear in the south of England. But in the north, in some parts of the north, you would describe that as a ginnel. And in relation to foreign languages, I was lucky enough to be a student in Montpellier in France, which obviously has quite a particular accent when they speak French there. And while I was there, I also went to other places like Avignon and Nîmes and Perpignan, which has a particularly marked accent, and Marseille as well, which also does. So definitely my French was influenced by that. And then after
Yes.
my degree, I lived in French-speaking Canada for 2 years, and the Quebecois accent is very different again. So from that point of view, I remember people at the time saying, "Oh, you sound, really French Canadian," or there are certain words that you say which make you sound very French Canadian. But they also, I remember one person in particular said there were certain words that you say that betray you, which I just thought was really lovely. In the, that idea of betraying the fact that you're not a French native speaker, that you're saying certain words which obviously sound as if you are Anglophone, as they say in Canada. You're an English speaker. So, but that was such a wonderful opportunity, not only to be in Montpellier for a year, and then also to be in French-speaking Canada to improve my spoken French, because my degree was in French linguistics, and I absolutely loved traveling and meeting people, and all the benefits you get from doing that, not only linguistically but culturally, and so on and so forth.
Love it. So, Joe, in the UK, is it a requirement? Is it part of compulsory school where you have to study a second language? And if so, where does it begin? Does it start kindergarten, or is it more of an elective course, or how is it? Because I'm interested to learn more. I know we talked a little bit through Twitter, but I'm interested to know. And everyone, you have to follow Joe on Twitter, @JoeDale, JoeDale. Follow him on Twitter, por favor. But tell us a little bit about the requirements for foreign language or second language learning in the UK.
Okay, so at primary level, back in 2014, languages were made compulsory for Key Stage 2, which is 7-year-olds to 11-year-olds. So that was fantastic. That was something that people have been fighting for many, many years. And then at Key Stage 3, which is 11 to 14-year-olds, languages are compulsory for the whole of Key Stage 3. But the way that things have changed in the education system in England in particular is we now have these things called academies, which are well over 50% of all schools. It's probably more like 70% now. And they don't have to follow the national curriculum. They can do their own thing. So, for example, you would expect in all secondary schools, even if they're academies, that students would study a language in year 7 and year 8. So that would be 11 to, say, 13-year-olds. But there are some academies that are not offering languages in year 9, which is when they're sort of 13, 14 years old, which obviously I'm very anti that idea.
Right.
But that's the way that it works. So I was going to say, it's supposed to be compulsory at primary level, but unfortunately there are still some primary schools which are not offering languages. In other words, they're flouting the government advice on this. And because Ofsted, which is the inspectorate that go into schools at primary, secondary, etc. Level, they do these inspections on languages in particular, or even what they call deep dives, which is when they go into look at a particular subject, be it at primary or at secondary, and they really do a deep analysis on how that particular subject is being taught. Even though there have been some deep dives in languages at primary level, there hasn't been the same focus, I think, in recent years, even though languages have been obligatory. So it's almost as if the government are seemingly turning a blind eye to some schools who are not putting in place statutory lessons, or maybe they're ticking that box by having maybe an after-school club, which was never the idea. The idea was to have curriculum time for languages, and not really just half an hour a week, but really, ideally say at least an hour a week. In my middle school, when I was teaching on the Isle of Wight, we had at Key Stage 3, we had 2 lessons of 50 minutes for the year 7s and year 8, so the 11 to 12 and 12 to 13-year-olds. And then at Key Stage 2, the year 5 and year 6s, they had 1 lesson a week of 50 minutes. And that allowed for really nice progression, I think, from when they came into year 5 right up until they left us and then went on to the high school. But then again, the school system on the Isle of Wight has changed. They've got rid of the middle schools, which has been the case for lots of areas in the UK. Even though I still think they're fantastic from the point of view of the children's development. I think that it allows them to extend their childhood a little bit longer, which I think is a lovely thing. But yet it changed in 2011, and it went from a 3-tier system to a 2-tier system. So my former colleagues who were teaching primary age children went to the primary schools in 2010, and then the teachers who were going to secondary in 2011, they all carried on with the same students from the year 6, year 7 to year 8. So they just all carried on to the local high schools. And so now, since 2011, it's been primary and secondary. So it's quite interesting. It's quite interesting the way things have changed. But personally, I loved teaching in the middle school. I loved teaching the primary age students and the secondary age students. And now I've been, for the last 13 years or so, I've been an independent languages consultant, traveling around, doing training, either face-to-face, but as a result of the pandemic, I've been doing most of my work via webinars and via online training.
I love that. And I am a middle school teacher at heart. I taught most of my time in public schools at the middle school level. However, for the last like 4 or 5 years, I've been teaching elementary students, and I absolutely love that. And I think it relates to, I have 2 young children, so it just all works in tandem. Interesting enough, I would like to dig a little bit deeper about world language instruction in England. So, and compare it with some stereotypical observations, I'll say, that I have of second language instruction here in the US. Well, historically, aquí en los Estados Unidos, here in the US, there's been like a large, like what's plagued this nation, one of the things that's plagued this nation is this multilingual mentality. And I understand with colonization, wanting to have English as a primary language, but I love the concept of developing your ears where you can acostumbrarse, get accustomed to speaking near native versus assimilating, because you start to lose your identity. So we have many people whose ancestors come from Europe and they ethnically identify with being Italian American, for example, or they may be Irish American, even though it's still English, or they may be from a country, their great grandparents or great 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 grandparents, now as time moves on, has come there. My ancestors were enforced to migrate through the African diaspora. It wasn't like, hey, please put me over there. No, this was not a choice. So that's a whole nother topic of how languages were stripped and taken away. But even for people who can trace back specifically what country they come from or their ancestors come from, it still was this English only, and there was discrimination if you didn't have a certain type of English, right? Let alone socioeconomic factors. And so now you have second generation children being born of people who have more recently migrated. And you have this, do I keep teaching my children and reinforcing the native language of our heritage, or do I want them to sound American enough? So that impacts world language instruction, whether it's from the funding or the rigor, the expectation. And I have such a strong passion for equipping my people with el bilingüismo, with bilingualism, because I'm saying over 50% of the world is bilingual and multilingual. Like that's like the norm. But here, I mean, in some communities, it's like just to convince people of the importance, let alone to equip the teachers and to put qualified educators, not just because they have a degree, but who can actually speak the language, so that we can actually set our children up for success. So I don't know, in comparing that with the UK, like, is there like an anti, or has there been historically, or do you see, I know you said a lot of the parents in the community, they were pushing to have languages be a requirement early on, but so does that then reflect that there's less of this anti, the English only mentality in England?
Well, I think having traveled here, there, and everywhere all around the world, I think that language teachers are sort of fighting their corner in relation to making it very clear to students of the power and the importance of language learning. So when I've been to places like Australia, to the States, here, there, and everywhere, I feel that language teachers are always showing this sense of solidarity and fighting the good fight, as it were, about the importance of language learning in relation to the UK in particular. I suppose the elephant in the room is Brexit, and I think that the influence that Brexit has had on potentially some attitudes of students and possibly their parents as well, thinking, well, why do we need to learn the language now because we've left the European Union? Linguists or people who are very pro languages would say the opposite, that we need to improve our understanding of languages in order to be able to converse with people from around Europe now that these ties are not as strong, which is a huge regret that I have personally, and I know lots of language teachers feel exactly the same way. So I think language teachers have always had that, have always found themselves in a situation whereby they have to, if you like, persuade lots of young people on the importance of languages. I think that it can be a hard sell in lots of ways. I think that languages, certainly in the UK, and there's been lots of reports about this from the British Council and other organisations about young people seeing languages as being difficult or hard, or that they'll get grades which are not as good in languages compared to in other subjects because of the whole debate around severe grading that the government could have addressed in the latest GCSE, so the exam that you take at the age of 16 in the UK. They could have addressed this idea that lots of people have been talking about for many years, the fact that you won't necessarily get as good a mark because of the way that the marks are set in a language compared to other subjects. And that obviously seems very unfair. So, for example, let's say you were doing subjects like English or geography or history. It's according to the data that has been put together over many years, in a language you will probably get at least one grade lower than other sort of traditional subjects. And there have been, as I said, there have been people like Helen Myers, who's a friend of mine, who's the chair of the London branch of the Association of Language Learning, along with her husband, David Blow, who've been campaigning for this for many, many years. And we feel this would make a big difference to the attitudes of young people in relation to languages if they felt they were on a level playing field. So that's definitely happened. So I think before Brexit, there was still absolutely the argument of, what's the point of learning languages, and parents saying literally at parents' evenings, well, I was never good at languages, therefore why should my son or daughter bother? Or parents who have children with special educational needs saying, well, I think that they need to focus on English rather than on the foreign language. All these different barriers that you can find are a challenge. But I think that as long as you make sure as a language teacher that your lessons are exciting and interesting and engaging and relevant, then you can buck the trend on that, and you can enthuse students on the power of languages. And I think that as a result of social media, in particular the MFL Twitterati community, which I've helped to nurture over many years, there are lots of excellent practitioners who are sharing their knowledge on a daily basis. And of course, for lots of teachers, it's really changed their life, being able to read about different ideas, sharing different resources, sharing the latest government initiatives. Or, for example, today the government has announced that they're going to spend £15 million on a new centre of excellence, and they're going to create these new hubs as well. And they're going to put out a tender for, it could be multi-academy trusts or different organizations to bid for that tender. And then once that tender has been approved and there's a new centre of excellence, then maybe that will see a difference in the way in which languages are taught in the UK as well. So in England, should I say, in England as well. So there's lots of change happening all the time. But I think that through social media in particular, which is one of the vehicles that I use a lot for keeping up to date with everything, I think that's a fantastic positive environment to help keep everyone up to date with what the government have been doing, or Ofsted, the inspection team, have been doing, and their latest initiatives. But more importantly, practical ideas that you can try out with your students quickly and easily, which can have a fantastic motivating factor with them. But with with the exam changes that we've seen recently with the
Yeah.
new GCSE, etc., I think having a community like that is amazing for keeping up to date. And I'm sure it's exactly the same with Lang Chat in the States as well.
Right. Right.
And I just think it's a wonderful thing. So there is that reluctance. There always has been that reluctance, but and I think that Brexit hasn't made things easier, let's say. But I think that with positive, dynamic, committed teachers, we can certainly buck that trend and improve things as they are.
Now that last part, the dynamic and committed teachers. I filed the trademark for Spanish S.W.A.G. It's an actual acronym that really is about empowering and equipping students with this consciousness to be aware of what we're saying so that you don't, and I don't know in England if you all have this equivalent, but aquí en los estados, here in the US, and people laugh about it. It's almost cliche for someone to say, yeah, I took Spanish in high school, quiero dos burritos. And it's almost like, I don't understand. Like, we almost like boast about our ignorance. That's why my song, I say, your ignorance is not conspicuous. You sound ridiculous. Or my daughter would say, redonkulous, and it's almost, there's almost this level of like boasting in the ignorance. And I cannot be mad at now adults that are doing this and they've gotten A's or received A's and B's in their language classes. And I was just doing a professional development recently here in Detroit with some teachers, and I said, I know I've been the person, you have to call the kids up, you're asking them a question. And so if I ask them, ¿Qué te gusta hacer los fines de semana? What do you like to do on the weekends? And if a student responds and says, me gusta ir al parque con amigos, that is an American gringo accent like I do not know what. Now, technically, es una frase completa. That is a complete sentence. Oh, the child's using a vocabulary. And I'm not trying to walk around and be the grammar police, but no one in Mexico, ni en España, ni Venezuela, ni Cuba says me gusta ir. So why? But I'm saying as an educator, I have to say, no, it's me gusta ir. Like, because my thing is, I'm not just trying to be your elective teacher. I'm giving you a skill set that literally can impact your trajectory academically, professionally, cross-culturally, your future GPS opportunities, and just being a good human, understanding and showing respect because it's someone else's language that you are even trying, attempting. So is that a stigma in the UK? Have you met students? I know sometimes it can come from parenting, maybe not valuing, or the school structure wise, but that's very common. Like on Saturday Night Live, there's always sketches where they're talking about people sounding like this, and everyone knows this. Or someone, oh yeah, quiero dos burritos, por favor. And it's like, huh? Have you heard that? Is that a thing that happens in England where people are butchering the language and that's just like the norm?
Yeah, I mean, the cliche is as long as you can say "dos cervezas, por favor," then you're fine when you go on a holiday. But I think there's a couple of answers to that. I think from the student's point of view, maybe because they don't want to appear silly in front of their peers, they don't want to seem as if they're not fluent in the language. That's why they will deliberately pronounce things with a bad accent or an English accent, let's say, when they're trying to speak in the target language. And I think that I may be wrong about this, but my understanding is in the States, because there are so many Spanish speakers, I would imagine that most people are going to be exposed to different Spanish accents much more than you maybe would get in the UK. So from that point of view, that can be a great way, I think, of tuning your ear. Certainly when I was living in Quebec, and the French speakers, the students who were learning French, who were maybe had a relative that could speak French, or were more exposed to hearing French, their accents were much better. Whereas if you live in an environment, and I appreciate that you have access to media and what have you now, which makes it a lot easier, but generally speaking, and to try and recreate this sort of French speaking or Spanish speaking or German speaking, what have you, capsule in the classroom, then that's a challenge. But I think hand on heart that trying to use the target language as much as possible in the classroom is absolutely the way to go. That's what I used to do a lot. I used to try to speak as much as possible in the target language because of the fact that the children would acquire so much without necessarily realizing it. And then on another point, I know I was talking about, say, at parents' evenings, when you might get some parents with. So I just said that bit again. And I know I was just saying about, say, at parents' evenings, when you might get some parents who have got, bad attitudes to language learning, you may also get lots of parents who say, well, I wish now I had learnt properly the language at
Yes.
school, because I regret that now, because I'm missing out on opportunities. Or when I go on holiday and I feel very embarrassed that I don't know how to speak a second language. And in lots and lots of countries, this is the absolute norm, that people can speak 1, 2, 3, 4
3,
languages.
4. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think things are changing from the point of view that we have so much access now to resources in the target language. So from a teaching point of view, it's amazing if we're looking for authentic text, whereas 20 years ago that just wasn't the case at all. So
No, it was not.
So I think
No, it was not.
we're in a lucky position now, even though we're still struggling with changing the attitudes of some students or some parents, I think.
Yeah. Okay. So I got to ask this question or bring this topic up. I'm more recently, I haven't seen, I'm on the last episode, but work has been so busy. I haven't seen this so long. Pero one of my now favorite shows, minus the violence, which is kind of hard because when people are fighting, I just always look the other way. But The Last Kingdom. It was first on BBC Network and then it was acquired by Netflix. But what I love the most from the show, and I know it's based on some historical occurrences, but it's still a drama, right? Realistic fiction. I did not know this. I was never taught this, even though it makes sense now from my American lack of knowledge about British history. The whole concept of United Kingdom is interwoven throughout this show because it's showing that on the Isle there were these independent kingdoms, and that the leaders of ¿cómo se llama?
Westminster.
Westminster, I'm sorry. Wanting to, was like Wesley, that's not right. I know Mercia is not called Mercia anymore. I don't know what the modern, I'm watching this show from the 800s. So they have some of the older names, but still it's this concept of you had these individual kingdoms. And so now you have United Kingdom. And I don't know why I never made that connection with the concept of United States, even though they weren't necessarily like kingdoms in the same regard. But similarly, now it's this united, at least geographically, or united nationally, even if not united on beliefs or customs and practices. But I just find that really interesting. Is that accurate, what I understand now, that the purpose of calling it United Kingdom is because there were historically different kingdoms on the same isle, but now became one country for England, one England, and then I know we have Ireland and that involved as well. Is that what I understand?
Okay, so obviously the United Kingdom is the term that we use for the home countries of England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. So that's referred to as the United Kingdom, whereas Great Britain is the British Isles, should I say? The British Isles don't include Northern Ireland. I think I'm right in saying that, but Great Britain does. But when you say the British Isles, that is just England, Scotland, and Wales. I hope I got that right. Otherwise, I'll feel the wrath of people. But
dun dun dun.
But yeah, geographically, countries are very near each other. But I think from a cultural point of view, I think Scottish people are certainly politically are much more to the left compared to England, which tends to be in lots of England anyway is more to the right. Although if one believes all the polls recently, that if there was a general election, that the current government would lose the vast majority of their seats. I'll believe it when I see it. But in Wales as well, likewise, there are I would say most people are to the left. And so with the whole Brexit issue, which Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland voted against, voted Remain, it now has created this vacuum or this issue around the fact that there are lots of people in these different countries who feel very strongly that we should never have left the European Union, and that we're being constantly lied to as a result of Brexit, because of the fact that the government don't want to admit to this huge mistake that they've made, because that would politically be very difficult for them. But I think we're going to have to come to a point whereby it's going to be so obvious that our economy is in decline, and so on and so forth, that they will have to do something. But I think that, having been many times to Scotland and to Wales and to Northern Ireland and to Southern Ireland as well, that people's attitudes are completely different in general. And I love going to those places. And as I said, I love traveling in general. But I think politically, but possibly to do with social media, or the idea of polarization, that Brexit has been such a thorn in the side of British people that I don't really know how we're going to get out of it, to be honest with you. I don't know how the UK is being seen by people in the States. If I think, having spoken to lots of European teachers, I've been doing these courses in Dublin recently and meeting with lots of teachers from literally all over Europe. They just think that the English are crazy for doing this. The English in particular, as opposed to British people. I think it's really the English people who have really, or Westminster, the Westminster bubble, as one says, who have been able to persuade all these people were able to persuade all these people to vote to Brexit in 2016, and then we've had the consequences of that when it's actually happened. I think that they all think that we're completely crazy, and I agree with them. I don't know why we made this mad decision, but we have done, and we have to live with the consequences. And that's why, if you are, let's say, an entrepreneur or someone who's a creative, it's just immediately cut off a lot of your opportunities that you could in the past, let's say, just jump on a plane and go to a country and do in Europe and do some training. But obviously for trade, those businesses that were based on just-in-time delivery have had huge problems. The Scottish fishing industry, for example, have had huge problems, and lots of those voted for Brexit. And then the farmers having to compete with the New Zealand lamb, for example, because of the fact that the British decided to do a trade deal with It's just a complete and utter mess. I know we're sort of going off languages a bit, but interesting to see how things have changed, and I'm sure that will affect attitudes about other people and other languages moving forward. So I just think it's been a huge disaster, to be honest with you.
Well, when it comes to, I'm a firm believer that language is a reflection of the culture of the people who speak that language natively and or through heritage, right? And so when things happen politically, there's that impacts also language too, because it impacts the people, it impacts the culture. And so, 100 years from now, there may be a shift in the lecto that may be a result of this exit, from the European Union. You never know how that plays and how that can impact the world and specifically the British Isles. Another quick question I have for you is, in England specifically, do people, because okay, here in the US, we think of like, oh, you're from the Midwest, or you're from the East Coast, or you from down south. And while that's not just your geographic, we talked about it's your dialect. It also relates to like your, almost like your subculture, sub in the sense of this national culture, even though it's your microcosm. So it really is your culture. Southern hospitality is a real thing. I lived in Texas por un año, and everyone, regardless of people's political status, everyone says yes, ma'am. I mean, and I was like, ma'am, and this was younger. I'm not somebody's mammy, right now, but like it's just the norm, even just culture, like, and that's language, like yes, ma'am. I remember my daughter, that she was 2, 1.5 when we moved. We lived in Costa Rica, and then I moved back to the U.S. when she was 1.5. And I never forget, like, she was coming home and she would say yes ma'am to me, and it threw me off because I'm in the Midwest, we don't say yes ma'am, but that's culturally within that region, right? That dialect, even though we're all speaking English. In England, I know you said like you were from the south of England, or like, do people resonate, like, even though you're British, do people like say, oh, I'm from the south of England? Like, is it that same where people are really like, oh, I know people say New York, but the East Coast, or I'm from the West Coast. I'm from, people are very regionally proud of their origins. Is it the same thing?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I
Okay.
mean, everyone is proud of where they come from. I normally find, particularly when people travel, they think very, they think very fond thoughts and are very proud of their homeland, as it were. Even more so when they're traveling and maybe they're comparing what life is like in the place they're going to on holiday, for example, compared to what life is at home. But yeah, absolutely, the place that you grow up in, it's incredibly important um, for your well-being and what feels normal. And in relation to expressions, for example, in parts of the north of England, people will say "hiya, duck," as it were, which might seem a bit odd to other people, but it just is a term of endearment. It's just like saying yeah, "hi there, sweetie," or whatever it might be, the equivalent.
Hi, Doug.
And
Is
I
that
just find
considered
it fascinating.
informal or formal? Does it
Oh, that
matter
would be
the
quite
context?
informal, but you might go into a
Informal.
shop, for example, and buy something, and someone might call you love or duck, depending on where you are in the country. And I think that's really lovely. As I say, when I travel to different parts of the UK, you get different attitudes. Generally speaking, the cliche is that people in the north are more friendly, are more willing to have a chat with you. I don't know if you've ever been to London, but it tends to be that everyone is not as forthcoming with speaking to you, or certainly on the underground. If you actually have a conversation with someone, they'll probably think you're a complete weirdo. So everyone's like looking at their feet, or listening to their phone, or doing something else, what have you, but not having a conversation. Whereas when I've been to other parts of the UK, it can be the complete difference. So the complete opposite. So it is fascinating. And I think also in relation to accents as well, which I ask whenever I meet people, let's say the European teacher I was mentioning in Dublin, who tend to be English teachers. I ask them about how do they find the Dublin accent, or how do they find the accent in places like Liverpool or Newcastle or Glasgow. And it's always really interesting to hear their take and what they think, and expressions that they've learned, or colloquialisms and this sort of thing. It's fascinating. That's one of the beautiful things about language, I think, the fact that it
I
is
love
very
it.
much context dependent, and the fact that you tend to be very proud of the place where you've grown up, but it's also fascinating to travel and to visit other places, and to learn
Yes.
the expressions that people use in other places around your local area, as well as further afield.
I love it. I love it. And it's a beautiful thing. Okay, I'm going to spell a word. I know we have to end pretty soon, but I want to spell a word because from the Midwest, I pronounce this word a certain way. When I first taught in 2008 in Baltimore, a lot of East Coast people from New Jersey, Connecticut, New York, as well as from Baltimore, would pronounce this simple word a different way. But I lived in Baltimore for 6 years. So now I pronounce this word that way. I don't know why. And then sometimes I don't, but I guess when I'm getting hype, I feel more, I don't know. I'm just going to spell this word and I want to hear how you pronounce it. I know
Okay.
there's a way according to the Webster or the Oxford Dictionary, but it's a simple word. It's not even, and we use it frequently. I just want to hear how you pronounce it so I can compare Midwest versus East Coast and see where it came from. Okay. The word is Director.
Right. Direcect.
It could be a school
Director.
blank. Say it again.
Director, I would say.
Okay.
Director. Yeah. So how would you pronounce it?
I would say from Detroit, I would say director because we say directions. Even though it's an I, we
Yeah.
say der. East Coast, director. Who's
Right.
I had a parent come one time and I was like, I remember I had hall duty and I was up front, and this was like fresh out of college. Okay, Jessica, you have hall duty. And I'm like in Baltimore, like, okay. And this parent came, and the door, we have to keep the doors locked, obviously. But I don't know if I was just distracted, but my back was kind of like towards the front door, and no one in the office was responding to her. So this parent was banging on the door, and I said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I ran to the door, and she said, teacher, where's the school director? Director. And I was like, the school director, versus die. I need to know, direct me where the director die and director. So I just find those little things very interesting. I pick those up all the time. I love it. Language is a reflection of culture. Culture is a reflection of your origin. And like you said, it's a beautiful thing. And then studying other languages and other cultures, to me, really just strengthens your own identity, because you're able to make connections that you cannot make in isolation.
And it
Whether
feels as
it's
if you're
cultural
almost
or
playing a role,
linguistic.
isn't it? When you're speaking the
Yes.
target language in a different language, then it feels like you're playing a role, and that can be very
Yes,
liberating, I think, as
it
well.
is.
Just in relation to words being pronounced in different ways. I mean, obviously you've got the classic aluminium, whereas in the States it would be pronounced aluminum, or
Aluminum.
oregano, or oregano, or there are many examples like that, or vehicle or
Oh, how do you
vehicle,
pronounce AGAIN?
AGAIN. Again, or you could
Again.
say
Okay.
again, I suppose, but I would normally say again.
Okay. Again.
Yeah.
Again. It gives me like these small little nuances too. Sometimes it's not like again versus again. And so also the way we pronounce certain words, imagine for someone who's learning English as a second language or a third or fourth language, and then it's like British Standard English versus American Standard English. And so it's like, well, wait a minute. Oftentimes words are written a certain way. And the English, what I find is really interesting, it's not like derived directly like Francés or Espanol from Latin, right? It has so many, it's not like one straight mother language that it came from. Es una mezcla de lenguajes diferentes. And so you'll have a little bit of this, a little bit of that sprinkling on there. And so it can be like, I always tell people we have 5 vowels in English, A-E-I-O-U, but they produce up to 20 different sounds. Whereas in Espanol, I don't know how it is in Francés, it's A-E-I-O-U. A is not it's only A. It will not change. And so for me, I find it also liberating, even linguistically and even with syntax and everything, because to me, for learning a romance language such as Spanish or Francés, like the beauty of it is like, okay, we have these vowels, and this is what really drives the language. And so if you've committed these vowels, and of course there's other linguistic items to learn as well, but I find that very liberating, because I can read sin problema, like, and it's all good to read. It's easier for me learning versus even simple things. My daughter, she's in second grade, and she'll say, Mommy, why is bear Bear, hair is Hair, and care is Care? And I'm like, well, silent for an E for care, hair like the air. It's just like random. It's not like this solid rule, but it's a beautiful thing nonetheless, because that's what makes the English language what it is. And so it really is like our sight words. You don't necessarily need sight words. I don't know in French if they stress sight words. In Spanish, you really don't stress sight words, because once you learn the phonetics, you should be able to read all the words.
Yeah, I think the thing about Spanish that I mean, I learned Spanish personally as a child a long time ago now, but I learned it for 6 years, and we were always told that one of the great things about Spanish, exactly what you just said, is that if you know how to pronounce the different letters, then phonetically it'll be fine. You should be fine with your pronunciation. Whereas with French, and certainly with English, as you say, you might get the same word but just pronounced completely differently, or words which have one letter difference which are pronounced completely differently as well. So that is the beauty of language, and the fact that we do have the opportunity now to listen to different languages on YouTube, on television, on radio, on podcasts. We can be exposed to these different languages very, very easily now, whereas in the past that just wasn't the case. I know you could listen to the radio, but it wasn't necessarily at the appropriate level or the appropriate age, let's say. Whereas now there's nothing stopping us really if we want to be exposed to different languages. So, but personally, that's something which I love about language, the way in which you can have different words pronounced in different ways. But of course, as a person learning that language, that can be difficult. But again, as I said, with Spanish, my understanding is that if you know how to understand the phonics of Spanish, that it should be straightforward. But that doesn't necessarily make learning Spanish easier than, let's say, French, because of the fact that you're using the subjunctive a lot sooner in Spanish compared to, let's say, in other subjects. So I always think it's dangerous to have a hierarchy of languages, to say one is better or easier than another one. But certainly in the UK, traditionally French has always been the most taught language, but in the past it was always German was the second most taught language, whereas in recent years it's definitely now Spanish. And there are some schools that don't offer French, only offer Spanish or Spanish and German, as opposed to French and German, which was always the case. So there's definitely a huge interest now in the learning of Spanish in the UK. That said, there are lots of German teachers who are absolutely fighting their corner for the importance of German as well. So it's just fascinating. You know, I mean, to me, the most important thing is that people are passionate about their subject, about their language. It doesn't matter which language it is, as long as we work together as a community. That's what it's all about, personally.
Yes. Oh, I love it so much. Okay. La última cosa, last thing. I always like to play this game, so I want to play it with you. It'll be real quick. I will say a phrase, very basic phrase, in a different language, and I want you, Joe, you have to guess what language am I speaking?
Okay.
Or what part of the earth if you don't know the specific language. But this should be easy. This should be fun. Okay, first one. I know you're going to get this one. Bonjour.
So that's French, obviously.
Mi chiamo Jessica. Mi chiamo.
So that's Italian.
Eso.
Okay.
Okay. Total different part of the world. Nina furaha kukutana na wewe. Nina furaha kukutana na wewe.
I don't know, but maybe that sounds like a bit like Maori, maybe from New Zealand.
Jambo, Nina furaha kukutana na wewe. Mimi ni Jessica.
Is it a South American language?
It's de Africa.
Okay.
Nina furaha kukutana na wewe. It is Swahili.
You have to tell me. I'm sorry, I don't know.
Swahili.
There we are.
Interesting enough, Swahili uses the same vowels as Spanish.
Okay.
It's really, I'm learning Swahili right now. Konnichiwa.
That's Japanese.
Versus ni hao ma.
Which is Chinese, Mandarin Chinese. Yeah.
Muy bien. I hope I don't mispronounce this one. Dzień dobry. Dzień dobry.
Is that Russian?
Close, but not Russian.
Polish?
Polaco.
That was a bit of a guess. Okay.
Okay, you give me one.
Okay.
Give me a phrase.
Now you put me on the spot. Just for everyone listening to this, this was not pre-prepared.
It was not planned. I'm always thinking one.
So I'm just trying to think.
Or if not,
here we go. You ready? Here we go. Borodar. No idea.
Repítate, por favor.
Okay, Borodar.
Ni idea. I have no idea.
Okay, that's Welsh. Well, it's supposed to be Welsh. So I taught in Wales for 2 years, and that's where I did my teacher training. So I lived in Wales for 3 years in total, and I didn't learn a lot of Welsh, but I remember Borodar. I remember Crosso as well, which means you're welcome. And yeah, so there we are. I'm limited. I'm very limited in that way. But,
well, I'm totally limited because I could not even picture where this was spoken. I was like, It's such a beautiful thing. But I'm so thankful. Everyone, you have to follow Joe on Twitter at Joe Dale. He is amazing, very insightful. Connect with him. He's like doing amazing work, especially with modern language consulting in the UK and abroad, since we can communicate and connect virtually as well as he's very well versed on a lot of tech tools that you can utilize to augment your instruction and podcasting as well. I'm learning so much from him. Joe, thank you so much. Un montón de gracias por haberse tomado tiempo de pasar conmigo. Thank you for spending this time with me and have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, Jessie.
Español.